what we have seen over the last 100 years and then really into overdrive over the last 5-10 years has been really the abandonment of the working class by journalists on the left.
How is this undermining democracy?
It's undermining democracy because a nation in which only the top 10% gets any media or any political attention is an oligarchy. It's not a democracy. And essentially, the left has participated in the deplatforming of the working class. We have lost respect for the kind of insight and intelligence that is developed outside of a meritocratic, highly educated rat race. And I think that is a huge threat to democracy.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. There's an interesting issue behind what seems like a political divide in this country, which is the media divide, and the divide, interestingly, on what's really driving this. Now, it's something you may not think about. It has to do with class, but ironically, the opposite of what is being presented to us on the surface. Here to help us understand this kind of bizarre class issue behind the woke media phenomenon is Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's the author of the book Bad News, and it's how woke media is undermining democracy. And Batya, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is a bit of an upside-down take on the reality that we've been shown by these media, because what you really explain is it's kind of like a history of journalism, but in a way that I've never actually heard before. That really you have this issue, this class issue in this country, that seems to be driving a lot of this. Can you tell us about this? You know, we're told it's all about race and income inequality. How does this actually work?
So my book is a populist history of American journalism. I start back in the 19th century with really the birth of American journalism. And what we saw from the fathers of American journalism, people like Joseph Pulitzer and Benjamin Day, was that they really thought that the point of journalism was to wage a crusade on behalf of the poor and the working classes. That was the whole point of journalism from where they were sitting. It should be by and for and about the working class and the poor. And they created what's called the penny presses. You know, up until then, newspapers were rather expensive, even though Americans were very literate. And they realized that these poor and working classes, they just had nothing to read, but a lot of interest. And so they started selling newspapers that cost a penny. And they created really a revolution in this way by really focusing on the people who needed them the most. Now, remember, the end of the 19th century was the Gilded Age. It was a time of immense income inequality. And to counteract that, journalists saw their job as really being on the forefront of bringing to light those issues. Now, fast forward to today, and we have sort of the opposite of that. What we have seen over the last 100 years and then really into overdrive over the last 5-10 years has been really the abandonment of the working class by journalists on the left. Now, I'm a lefty, and so I'm coming at this as somebody who feels like my job is to elevate the working classes, to elevate labor, to elevate the poor and their issues. But what happened was the mainstream media, liberal mainstream media, has really abandoned that fight in favor of one around issues of identity, wokeness, issues like critical race theory and intersectionality that are really, really alien to the concerns of working class Americans of all races. And I argue that those two things go hand in hand, that the woke moral panic we're in terms of the liberal media today is just the last stage of the abandonment of the working class on the part of a meritocratic, liberal, highly educated elite.
And this is interesting because it contradicts a lot of the surface narratives that are being fed. We would think that the people who at least claim that they represent the poor and the downtrodden would actually be representing that. But what you're saying is kind of the opposite, that they represent this college graduate elite, essentially, that does have a greater hold on income in this country than the people, ironically, they seem to be opposing. Explain this to us a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think 50 years ago, you would think about the two sides in America, the two parties in America, as you had the Democrats who were the party of labor, the party of the poor, the party of the working class, and then you had Republicans who were the party of the rich. Today, what you have is the Republicans still representing the rich, and the Democrats representing the highly affluent, educated. What happened was liberals got very educated, and especially over the last 20 years, that education has actually translated into affluence. Liberals have become much more affluent. They've become part of the elite, part of the top 10%. So if journalism was once a working class trade and you would have a journalist who made, maybe a little bit more than his neighbor, the cop, today, journalism is a very elite caste where you have journalists who make maybe a little bit less than their neighbor, the corporate lawyer, right? There's just been a total status revolution among journalists, but really among highly educated liberals. And what we're seeing in the media is instead of sort of recognizing this and having humility about it towards the working class who they've sort of left in the dust, you see them having this kind of contempt for them, this sort of sneering disregard for them. You saw that a lot in the coverage of President Trump and his followers, the majority of whom did not have a college degree, right? So it's been this sort of this abandonment of the working class. But what's happening is you're seeing liberal journalists using race in order to justify sneering at the people who have sort of lost out in the, information age economy, and using racism as a way to sneer at them instead of to uplift them. And I argue that this is really dangerous for democracy because we're essentially headed in the direction of an oligarchy where you have liberal and conservative media each catering to the top 10% of their side and nobody catering to the bottom 90%. And politicians are taking their cues from the media, right? So they're understanding, who is at stake here, whose interests are at stake here, and it's really the elite.
I want to get a bit into that history because you explain it really well in your book. But first, I want to go in a bit into this whole divide because it is interesting that, yeah, you're right. If you watch a lot of mainstream media shows, they will criticize the average American. They tend to view them as like flyover country, don't pay attention to them, they're uneducated. And that's typically how they frame them. You remember actually one of the big criticisms of Trump was his uneducated voting base. Like this was such a bad thing. And the way they talk about them is typically along those lines. I mean, what is the significance of the way that these elites, ironically, view the uneducated American? It's almost become a bad word in a way,
We can remember a time when liberals respected the education of life, the kind of education you got like as a lineman, the kind of education you got as a bartender, right? That kind of education that you got working in a factory, right? We can remember a time when cops and nurses were considered to be people who were bringing lived experience to the table, and that we respected that and valued that lived experience, and we wanted to see them as an active part of, the fabric of American society. And what happened was we've undergone this great sorting where liberals tend to live near liberals, conservatives live near conservatives, and liberals increasingly are represented by those with an elite education or an education in college. And what's happened is, we see now value coming out of this kind of meritocratic view, where people now really on the left have come to respect only a certain kind of education. And it's not the education you get from working or from living, it's the kind of education you get from a university. And the more elite that university, the better. And I think that what that's resulted in, the stakes are extremely high. If you look at, for example, the people now who don't want to get vaccinated, some of them are the very people who kept us alive throughout the pandemic, right? You have cops and nurses, right, who are now being threatened with fired and actually fired because they don't want to get the vaccine. And you can imagine a world in which journalists who got to work at home for the pandemic, right, in the safety of their homes, in their pajamas, right? And we can imagine a world where we would look at these people who went to work every day at the height of the pandemic, right? And we said to them, you know what? Thank you so much for what you did. You don't want to get vaccinated? We'll find another way to make sure that the people you interact with are safe. Maybe we'll do antibodies testing. Maybe we'll do COVID testing every day. And you can imagine a world in which the respect for the labor they put in during the pandemic was sort of given back to them at this time. Instead, what you see is just unbelievable sneering and even rage at these people. There's zero gratitude. And I think that really stems from that class chasm that we're seeing in America, where people who have a certain kind of education, they just do not respect the other side, especially if they voted for Donald Trump, they do not think that they have a role in building up this nation. They don't even really respect their franchise, right? And I think that that's really a shame. And I think that it is a little bit of the left has abandoned the very people who need us the most. Now, I have to say, right-wing media is much better at catering to the values of the working class. But it's not like they are picking up the economic populism that Trump really offered to his voters, that really made him popular with them. You really do see that the conservative media, I think, is still catering to the elites through this kind of free market view of America. And so it does seem to me like both sides have really abandoned the working class economically. I do have to say, though, at least right-wing media doesn't sneer at their values while doing it.
Interesting. Well, folks, 2 months on now, and we are still totally demonetized by YouTube. But given the situation where we have to censor ourselves if we want to really stay on this platform and make it work, we've decided on something else, which is this. We've launched a new platform called Epoch TV, EPOCHTV.com. And through this, we're able to publish uncensored content. News that can criticize anything we'd like, news that can talk about anything we'd like, news that can give you real information from any part of the world about any topic without having to worry whether individuals will censor it. And in this current environment where information is being controlled, where narratives are being controlled, and where anyone who steps outside the boundaries of what is the accepted narrative by the fact checkers, quote unquote, by different big tech organizations, by media organizations, and so on. This is something that we believe is needed for the modern political environment, where people should be able to call things out. People should be able to question things. This is the basis of the Fourth Estate in America. The belief, again, that media should be able to hold government power in check, and that media should be able to inform the public about the issues they should be informed about, because that is the basis of our election system. An informed public making informed decisions. If you control this system of information, you control the political system. And folks, being a media organization, we can't stand for that. And so again, we have created an uncensored platform, Epoch TV. And anyone who wants to support Crossroads or support our broader mission of bringing real news, uncensored news, that's not afraid to stand up for what matters, please check out our website, epochtv.com, EPOCHTV.com. Check out the link below, and folks, please support us there.